evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I normally, when it's a live audience, I ask by a show of hands if people can just indicate if they are recreational cannabis users. Obviously, on a webinar, that will be a bit difficult, but you are welcome to share your experience with us in the chat section. So we're talking about cannabis, and so why are we talking about cannabis? So basically, 3 reasons. I'm sure we're all aware of the quite significant law change we had in 2019 with the legalization of recreational cannabis. In many ways, we're still trying to get to grips with this change, specifically in terms of how it affects us in the workplace, clinical practice, and even just in our daily lives. So I'll say a few things about that. The second thing the second point is to do with the rise of medicinal cannabis and medical cannabis products. It's becoming a very big topic nowadays. As we speak, there are more research coming out about it. We can probably talk about it for days on end, but I'll just briefly touch on it and give you the highlights in terms of medicinal cannabis through this webinar. And then lastly, many of you may know or may not know, but there's been a big shift in the way and the manner in which recreational cannabis is being used throughout the world. So it's not really the topic of this webinar, but we'll say a few things about recreational cannabis use later on. So cannabis comes from the Cannabis sativa plant, a weed-like plant, likes to grow where there's lots of water in the tropics. And it would have been just another indistinct weed-like plant if it wasn't for the fact that it happened to, in abundance, contain a very potent psychoactive compound called tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC for short. So THC is found throughout the plant, but it's typically concentrated in the flowering tops of the female plant. And historians believe that it might have been that cannabis was one of the first plants ever to be cultivated by humans. But unlike popular belief, it wasn't cultivated for its psychoactive properties, but more for its fiber-like properties, giving us the raw material we call hemp. And hemp has been used to make many products throughout history, but most importantly, it was used to make rope, clothing, as well as, or even paper. And historians found evidence of hemp being used in rope making as far back as 8,000 years BC. There's also evidence of early Chinese and Indian civilization using cannabis in religious practices and also potentially as medical agents going back 2,000-3,000 years ago. But the Western world only got to learn of the psychoactive properties of cannabis in 1850. And then it took another 100 years or so for us to isolate the active compound THC, and THC was discovered in 1964. So just focus on this map on the blue areas. The blue areas are the countries where recreational cannabis is now legal. It's quite a diverse group of countries. So apart from ourselves, it's Canada, most of the states in the US, Mexico, Uruguay, Malta, Georgia, Thailand, and a few islands and territories scattered about here and there. So when we say legal in the sense of recreational cannabis, what we mean by that is that you have the right, or you are allowed to possess, cultivate, and consume cannabis products in the privacy of your own home. Being legal, or cannabis being legal in a recreational sense, has got no bearing on the commercial aspects or a large scale cultivation of cannabis. So just to keep that in mind. That is, those type of laws are quite complicated. It's different from country to country, and I'm not going to go into that now. It's worth noting that throughout the rest of the world, recreational cannabis is illegal for all practical purposes, although laws governing recreational use is very seldom enforced in particularly South America and the Indian subcontinent. So the natural cannabis product contains about 500 compounds, of which 100 or so are the so-called cannabinoids. So cannabinoids are compounds that like to bind to cannabinoid receptors. And humans got two types of cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2. CB1 is found mostly on immune cells, typically T cells, and it's thought that binding of cannabinoids to CB2 receptors is responsible for the immune modulatory effects of cannabinoids. CB1 receptors are found on cells in the central nervous system, and binding of cannabinoids to CB1 receptors is most likely responsible for the psychoactive symptoms associated with cannabinoid intake. So knowing that there were cannabinoid receptors, researchers knew that they were probably endogenous ligands. So the endocannabinoids were discovered in 1992. Those are the two most important ones. I'm not going to try to pronounce them, but release of these endocannabinoids has got very much the same type of effect of the exogenous compounds. In other words, gives you a feeling of calmness, relaxation, euphoria, and also have immune modulatory effects. So I mentioned that there's 100 or so cannabinoids, but I think for practical purposes, we should really only talk about the two main ones and most important ones this evening. The first one being THC. As I mentioned, the most active, potent, psychoactive compound found in the wild type plant, and its two metabolites, the active metabolite hydroxy-THC and the inactive metabolite carboxy-THC. And the other important cannabinoid, cannabidiol, or CBD for short, the cannabinoid with the most potent immune modulatory effects. But it's worth noting that CBD has got no psychoactive properties. It's just also worth mentioning that the cannabis plant, or the cannabis sativa plant, has undergone so much cultivation and cross-cultivation over the years that there are many strains out there today, to such an extent that it's hard to say what the original wild type plant is supposed to look like. Many people feel that strains today are so far removed from the original plant that it's even sometimes, or they consider it to be a different species. So you might have heard of Cannabis indica and Cannabis ruderalis and so forth. It can get all a bit complicated, so I think I'm not going to go into that. For practical purposes, it's probably better just to look at the purpose for which cannabis is cultivated, and to look at the end product for what, to determine what kind of plant it is, or what sort of strain it is. So cannabis cultivated for recreational purposes, we typically call marijuana. These plants have a high THC content and a low CBD content. And when we cultivate cannabis sativa for medical or fiber-like properties, we call it hemp. And these strains typically have a low THC content and a very high CBD content. Just to give you an idea in terms of content, compounds with a 25% and higher THC content is considered extremely high. Taking product with that sort of quantity of THC will have major psychoactive effects on those taking it, whereas THC content of 1% and less is considered very low, and you're very unlikely to experience any psychoactive effects when you take a product with that low THC content. So by the time recreational cannabis was legalized in 2019, the scheduling of these drugs went not up to date yet. In fact, Parliament already noticed in 2014, knowing that recreational cannabis legalization is on the cards, knew that there will be a problem with these scheduling and passed the medical innovation bill that was supposed to look at this. But by the time we had recreational cannabis legalized, they haven't changed it yet. So at that time, CBD in any quantity was still considered a Schedule 4 drug. In other words, you can only consume and use it on prescription. THC was considered a Schedule 7 drug. In other words, a controlled substance in the same sort of vein as heroin and other hardcore drugs, and not considered a medicinal drug at all. So luckily this has now changed, and the new scheduling came into effect in 2021. So CBD is now still a Schedule 4 drug when it's prescribed in high dose for specific medical conditions, but there's no scheduling attached to it if you consume it in any quantity via a natural product, or when you consume it via homeopathic product in very low dosages. THC is now a Schedule 6 drug, meaning that it can be prescribed for a medical condition. This is now in high dose, but very strangely or bizarrely, you can take it in any quantity if you want, as long as you take it in via a natural product where there's no scheduling attached to it, or you can take it in a homeopathic compound or product in very low dosages, but then it must be very low, less than 0.01%, or sorry, 0.001% of THC. So it's still a bit bizarre that you can now get THC prescribed in high dosages, but you can take it yourself as much as you like in your own private dwelling if you want to. So now over to medical cannabis and medicinal cannabis products. I'm not going to go into detail here. This is just sort of an overview of the topic. As I said in the introduction, we can probably talk about this for ages, but I'm just going to give you the highlights. So medicinal cannabis products come in every consumable form, pills, smokable forms, baked goods, lotions, potions, everything you can think about. But the big question really is cannabis or the cannabinoids effective in the treatment of medical products? So you don't have to look any further than this quite a landmark, pretty famous article that was published in 2015 by Penny Whitting. It was a massive review. And even if you look at more recent reviews, many of them will refer back to this view by Penny Whitting. They only looked at randomized controlled studies. They looked at 79 of them, 6,000 participants altogether, and they looked at cannabinoids in general. They didn't specify any specific cannabinoids, and looked at the effectiveness in terms of treatment of various medical conditions. And this is basically what they found. They found fairly good evidence that cannabinoids is effective in treating 5 specific conditions. These conditions are nausea and vomiting, anorexia, specifically in terms of anorexia nervosa, chronic pain, spasticity, specifically in the context of multiple sclerosis, and also glaucoma. What they found through their study or with their review is that in terms of treatment of nausea and vomiting and anorexia, these compounds tend to have a higher THC to CBD ratio, implying that's the THC that's most of the effect there. It wasn't very high levels. The average sort of THC level was sort of in the region of 1%. For the other 3 conditions, they had a lower THC to CBD ratio. That will imply that it was more the CBD that has the effect there, the immune modulatory effects of the CBD that had the most effect there. They found no evidence that cannabinoids have an effect on depression, anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, psychosis, Tourette syndrome. They have found no evidence that cannabinoids help in cancer conditions, although they admitted they had a little data in their series that they looked at. They found that there was some evidence that cannabinoids can be effective in autoimmune conditions, but admitted in the data that they looked at, there weren't a lot of, or they didn't have a lot of data in the series that they reviewed. So just to look into a bit further into the cannabis as an anti-cancer agent, this is also a fairly large review, also fairly well-known, a German review published last year, specifically look at cannabinoids as anti-cancer agent. They looked at 208 peer-reviewed articles. I'm basically just going to read what they said in the conclusion. I can't really say it any better. So in the conclusion, they say, this review of clinical data suggests most published peer-reviewed case reports provide insufficient data to support the claim for cannabis as an anti-cancer agent. So I don't think we need to say more about that. And then in terms of autoimmunity, nowadays we've got a much better understanding on how the endocannabinoid system works. And we do have plausible mechanisms of action on how endocannabinoids or cannabinoids in general might affect or alleviate autoimmune conditions. So there's more and more evidence coming out almost as we speak, and it's very promising evidence. And as things stand currently, there's fairly good evidence being provided that cannabinoids can help in rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and specifically inflammatory bowel disease. This is a growing subject, and I think as we go forward, going into the future, this might become a big topic. So now just over to cannabis metabolism. Whether you take it by inhaling it or an oral product, it gets metabolized in the liver, first to its active metabolite, 11-hydroxy THC, and then to its inactive metabolite, carboxy THC. This gets excreted in the urine, but also in the GIT tract, where it then undergoes intrahepatic recirculation. But very importantly, a large portion of the carboxy THC gets sequestered in the fatty tissue and then re-released into the circulation over time, where it then gets excreted into the urine. And this will explain why you can have a positive urinary THC test that's positive many days or weeks after you've taken or after your last intake of a THC containing product or a cannabis product. So I'm not going to focus on this, but just one or two things about recreational cannabis. So recreational cannabis is typically taken in by two forms. It's either smoked, and there's millions and different ways of smoking it, or it's taken in by an oral method, many times in baked goods. But a big trend that's now developed specifically in Northern Europe and now in Northern America, and is now also spread to Europe, is the vaping of cannabis. This is a big problem specifically in school children. And the two big reasons that it's such a big problem is firstly because of accessibility. It's very easy. There's no preparation. You just need your vape and you get the cannabis oil. And the second problem is the potency of these products. Cannabis oil can have THC percentages of way above 50%, going to 60, 70%. And these potent products are extremely harmful to especially school children. I'll say something about this a bit later, but this is becoming a real problem and a trend that I suspect will land onto our shores, if it hasn't done so already, in the near future. So just to complete our section on the metabolism, so if you inhale or smoke cannabis, what happens? You get a THC spike within the first 30 minutes and then quickly drops, coming down to about 0 within 2 to 3 hours. So in other words, when you smoke a cannabis product, the effect is seldom lasting more than 2 to 3 hours. In terms of oral products, you get a slow rise in your THC level that typically peaks around 4 hours and can take up to 8 hours to go back to zero. So the implication here is that taking an oral product, the effect of cannabis can last much, much longer than smoking cannabis. Not going to go into detail here. We all know about the physiological signs of taking cannabis. The red eyes, increased appetite is probably the most well-known. In terms of the specific neuropsychiatric symptoms, the so-called high, we all know what that looks like. I'm not going to go into that either. But the thing I want to emphasize here is the psychomotor effects. And many people are not aware of that, but this can last from anything from 12 to 24 hours after you've taken a cannabis product. And this, of course, include things like slow reaction time, impairs attention and concentration. And this is a problem, especially for school children, for students, and obviously people operating heavy machinery. So this is a big problem, many times underestimated by people using cannabis products. So the one thing about cannabis is that through the years, it's always been sort of seen as an innocent drug. It's associated with fun, somewhere sitting on a beach. And there was a general feeling that it's pretty harmless. But in actual fact, that's not the case at all. And I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the adverse effects of cannabis use. And in this vein, a campaign started in the US about 10 years ago, the Think Again campaign. And the aim of this campaign, and then spread over to Canada, and it's now also started in Europe. This campaign just wanted to highlight the adverse effects and just to highlight the fact that marijuana or cannabis is in actual fact not as harmless as many people think. There's a very nice article about this topic published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2014. That there's the reference on the screen. It goes through it in quite detail, but I'll just quickly give you the highlights of that article. And the one thing they start off with is the fact that cannabis is actually addictive. Not many people know that. It's not as addictive as some of the hardcore drugs or nicotine. It's about as addictive as caffeine. Sort of 9% of people have real difficulty kicking the habit because of a real physiological addiction. So just to bear that in mind, it doesn't affect everybody, but a significant portion of people have difficulty kicking the habit because of a severe addiction. The second thing is the effect of cannabis on brain development. So this has been a big topic and a big debate for many, many years. People refer to this as a so-called weed brain, but not everybody was really convinced about this. But this whole debate was put to bed in 2012 by also a landmark, fairly well-known article published by Madeline Meyer, a US group. And what they did is they did a long-term study where they followed up people for 38 years and basically testing their IQs at childhood and again in adulthood. And basically what they found, if you now look at this graph way on the left, infrequent use of cannabis before the age of 18 is associated with a significant drop in IQ in adulthood. So you can see on that graph, there's a drop in the IQ in adulthood compared to childhood. Now, if you look at the graph just next to that, frequent use of cannabis, and they define frequent use of daily cannabis use before the age of 18, this drop is even more pronounced. So you can see again a significant drop in IQ of adult IQ compared to childhood IQ. Even if you start using cannabis after adulthood, or in other words, after the age of 18, there's some effect. If you look way on the graph, way on the right now, frequent cannabis use started after the age of 18 is also associated with a drop in IQ in adulthood. The only exception to this whole thing, but we don't have to focus on that, is it seems that infrequent cannabis use after the age of 18, there's a slight increase in your IQ. but let's not focus on that. The main point here is heavy use before the age of 18 has got a major detrimental effect on brain development, and this is now proven without a doubt. The second thing is the issue of, or the third thing rather, is the issue of cannabis being a gateway drug. So we know that the response of other drugs can be enhanced by alcohol and nicotine. And there's some mouse models that was wondering if this could be the same, if cannabis could have the same effect, although it's not really been proven to be the case with cannabis. Many people here feel it's just what they refer to as the progression argument, and that simply states that cannabis, if someone wants to take drugs or use a drug, cannabis is just the easily most accessible drug to get hold of, and there's no inherent property of cannabis that makes it the progression, or that makes it the gateway drug. It's just a question of accessibility. But this story is still a bit of a debate. This is just the two views at the present moment. Then there's the issue of cannabis and mental illness. Admittedly, this has been a little bit overemphasized by the popular media. There's definitely an increased risk of developing schizophrenia while using cannabis, but similar to the effect on mental or brain development, the key here is early heavy use. In other words, before the age of 18. It's fairly rare otherwise with people using it infrequently in adulthood. Then there's the issue of cancer and other cardiovascular risk factors. So cannabis smokers and users love to say this. They point out that 500,000 people each year die from smoking-related illnesses, but those same risk factors don't apply to them or cannabis smokers. This is in fact not true at all. There's the same associations of COPD, cardiovascular risk, and cancer that you have with smoking also apply to cannabis smokers, although the association is significantly less and weaker. I think one problem here is our comparison with smoking. It's basically saying or comparing dynamite with an atomic bomb and saying dynamite's 1,000,000 times safer than the atomic bomb. It might be true, and the same goes with the argument about comparing smoking and cannabis. Smoking is just so inherently bad for you that anything that you compare with smoking is going to look good in comparison. So the main key point here is cannabis smoking and cannabis use has got also have cardiovascular, COPD, and cancer risks. All right, so to finish things off, I'm just going to talk now about the way we test for cannabis in the laboratory. So we basically have two types of tests we do. We can do a screening test and what we call a confirmatory test. Please bear in mind that we can only test urine samples and we can only test clinical samples. We frequently get a request like that, where people just send us stuff in a little bag and they want us to determine if it is cannabis or not. Unfortunately, we cannot do that. As I said, we can only test for clinical samples. So we use immunoassay in the laboratory, in our laboratory. We use 50 nanograms per mil as the cutoff, and anything above that we would consider or call positive for exposure to THC in particular. So we get many questions when we send out these results about the results. And the first or the most common question is there other possibilities? In other words, could this be a false positive? Could there be other reasons we get a positive result? So before I get to that, I just want to point out one or two things about the testing. The first thing is it's a semi-quantitative assay, and the value we get effectively means very little. The value cannot tell you anything in terms of the timing or the quantity of cannabis consumption. So whether, if you look at the little graph there, whether you've taken a very large amount, say 2 days ago, a moderate amount just before testing, or small amounts up to the days of testing, the actual cannabis or THC value of the test cannot tell you that. The second thing, and that's an important point, a positive test does not imply intoxication at that moment. In fact, the patient is probably not intoxicated at all. So just bear in that mind. There's a misconception sometimes that it doesn't work like a blood alcohol test. It's not a patient that's tested positive on the urine test is not necessarily intoxicated or symptomatic from taking cannabis. So now to the question, could it be something else? The short answer, in terms, could it be something else that giving you a positive test or positive answer? The short answer, as I said, is no. It's a very unique molecule, cannabis. We actually test the THC metabolites, so carboxy and hydroxy THC. Nothing else really looks like it. And whether, admittedly, some of the other drug tests can be influenced by over-the-counter medication and sometimes some dietary products. It's not the case with THC. The other question we get frequently, could it be medical marijuana or medical cannabis products? Again, the short answer is no. CBD and the majority of the other cannabinoids does not affect the THC assay. It does not make the THC assay to be positive. Of course, here, this is now implying that you've took a medical product that does not contain significant amounts of THC. And many people have been caught out by this because many of these products are not sold by very reputable retailers, and inadvertently you can get or take in some THC. So just to bear that in mind. But generally speaking, CBD and the majority of the other cannabinoids will not give you a positive cannabis urinary test. Then this is a frequent excuse we get from school children, where they say that they didn't smoke the cannabis themselves. They were just sitting next to them, and they were implying that it was passive inhalation that's responsible for the positive test. Could that be? Essentially, with the 50 nanogram per ml cutoff, that is not really possible. A positive in that sort of above that level almost certainly imply personal cannabis use. I must admit, though, that I suspect that we might encounter some problems with this going forward, because this is just to show you over time, and especially with the fact that people now vape these products, the THC content of marijuana and recreational cannabis products has been steadily climbing over the years as cultivation methods and processing methods have increased. So potentially in the future, with the use of very high potency products, passive inhalation might be a theoretical problem that we should take note of. Then in terms of the cannabis detection time, since your last exposure, that will be determined by the amount of cannabis that you took in and your fat mass, since cannabis gets sequestered into your fatty tissue. In general, that can be anything from a few hours to a few days. Very heavy smokers can be positive up to 40 days after their last intake. But I would say in our laboratory, the average is around about 2 weeks for the general cannabis user. We do confirmatory testing on a mass spec instrument. It's really in the context, we only really do it in the context of medical, legally context. It's not really needed in otherwise, because as I said, the immunoassay that we do for screening is a very specific assay, so we don't always need the confirmatory testing. But it is available should you want to do it, and it 100% confirms that the molecule that's present is either carboxy or hydroxy THC. So what does a negative test mean? Just a few things that we must look out for here. A negative test can imply that they did not use a cannabis product. It could imply that they did not use it recently. They can use it below the physiological quantity of the test. And the important factor to consider is that you've tested too early. And this is many times a problem when people are acutely intoxicated. They send them to the lab or take a sample immediately, and then it comes back negative and nobody understands what has happened. But just bear in mind, the test picks up the metabolites, carboxy and hydroxy THC, and those take at least a few hours to develop. So if someone is taking a cannabis product and within an hour you test the urine, there's a possibility that they might taste negative. And then lastly, there's always the possibility of foul play, where people tamper with their samples. A common method is to dilute it with water. Other things, if they've got a little bit of an understanding of chemistry, they know that dramatic pH changes or oxidative compounds added to the urine might affect the assay. That is true, it can do that. In that case, we typically look for samples that look suspicious. It typically causes a color change. But if you suspect that the sample might be tampered with, you can ask for adulterants, where we actually test the sample to see if some of these things were added and that it is a legitimate sample. So we have looked into this, and we will, we in a way still looking at it, but we are looking into testing cannabinoids and particularly THC on blood. It will work similar to a blood alcohol test, and this would be to confirm intoxication. Obviously, with the law change and everything that's gone, that's associated with that, and how people are being assessed in the workplace, we feel that this might be an assay that becomes necessary in the future. So we're looking at it into this, and hopefully we'll be have it available, as I said, in the near future. Thank you very much. This is the end.